There was a book hidden in the chapel, and 15 boys died for reading it. That was the phrase scrawled in ink, nearly illegible, on a torn piece of parchment sealed inside the floorboards of a seminary that hasn't seen daylight in 2 centuries. But we weren't supposed to find it. The chapel was closed, condemned, locked by order of the Presbyterian Church since 1823. But secrets don't stay buried forever, especially the ones that scream in silence. What happened at Whitmore Seminary was not an illness. It was a ritual, kind of ritual that burns through generations of silence. 15 young men, all training to become ministers, all dead within 6 weeks. Every single one convulsing, every single one blackened at the fingertips. Every single one screaming blasphemous Latin phrases that no God-fearing man should know. Phrases that weren't in any scripture. But beneath it, official records list their deaths as consumption. But even in 1823, people knew that was a lie. The local physician refused to sign the death certificates. He said their blood wasn't natural, said it moved like oil and smelled like sulfur. Then he vanished, burned his notes, and fled the county that same night. Presbyterian Church sealed the building and never reopened it. Not once. They buried the students behind the chapel in unmarked graves. No headstones, no sermons, no last rites. But last year we found a letter. A surviving student, David Crane, wrote it before he died. Hidden in the lining of an old hymnal, stored in a private collection. He wrote of a book inside the chapel, a book none of them should have read. A book that taught them a truth so vile, it twisted their minds and devoured their bodies. And now we're going to read it with you. Slowly, carefully, because what's coming isn't a story, it's an unraveling. This is where the mask comes off, the veil lifts, and history begins to bleed. Stay with me, because after this won't be the same. The name of the book was never written, only described. Bound in a skin not known to man, Crane wrote, with ink that shimmered even in darkness, and pages that felt neither dry nor wet, but something else entirely. The students had found it by accident. During a storm, the chapel's roof began to leak, and Hartwell, the oldest among them, climbed into the rafters to investigate. There, tucked beneath a rotted beam, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed with iron wire, was the book. They believed it was some ancient volume of theology, perhaps a relic from the early Reformation, forgotten in the church's expansion. But from the moment they opened it, things began to change. At first it was subtle, nightmares, whispers in the corridors, a coldness in the air that lingered even when the fire was burning strong. But then came the knowledge, foreign, precise, and terrifyingly intimate. Students who could barely conjugate Hebrew began reciting entire stanzas of ancient languages they had never learned. One boy, Timothy Brennan, began speaking in full Akkadian, a dead language lost for 3,000 years. Another claimed to see words burning through the walls of his dormitory, only visible in moonlight. They began gathering at night, not in the chapel, but behind it, near the unmarked burial plots of long-dead ministers. Marcus Hartwell led them, not in prayer, but in something else. Readings, they called it, scripture that predicts scripture. The faculty noticed something was wrong, but Dr. Ashford hesitated. He believed in discipline, not superstition. He saw theological fervor, not possession. He saw obsession, not infection. But by then, it was too late. One by one, the boys began to deteriorate. They were not sick in any way medicine could measure. But their eyes grew darker, their speech more fragmented, and their voices began echoing with tones that were not their own. On the night before Thomas Millikan died, someone broke into the seminary library and stole 3 books: Calvin's Institutes, Augustine's Confessions, and the oldest Bible on the premises, handwritten, imported from Geneva, and locked in a glass case. None of them were ever found. But Dr. Whitley, before he vanished, left a single note on his desk, written in trembling hand. They were not reading the book. The book was reading them. 3 deaths, 3 warnings, 3 identical phrases uttered in death, The book in the chapel, God Forgive Us All. By the time Samuel Brewster died, the phrase had become a curse. No one dared speak it aloud. David Crane, the only survivor, wrote it over and over in his letters, as if the act of repeating it could contain its meaning, like an exorcism in ink. He claimed the book had an intelligence, not like a man, like a mechanism. It calculated, and once it was opened, it began processing. Not the world, but the readers. It doesn't give knowledge, Crane wrote, collects obedience. Each page led deeper into something structured, hierarchical, and predatory. A kind of theology that didn't ask for worship but compliance. Symbols burned into their minds like brands. Chants that mimicked prayer but invoked something other. And the symptoms, the black fingernails, the convulsions, the Latin phrases, were not illness. They were signatures. Proof of submission. Hartwell had changed first. He started writing sermons in an unknown language that curved in spirals and bled off the paper. He claimed he no longer needed sleep, that God had stopped speaking to him and something older had taken his place. He called it the architect. But what terrified the students wasn't what Hartwell said. It was how right he sounded. Voice began to carry something behind it. A weight, a vibration that made their skin crawl but their minds follow. He could speak nonsense, and still they would nod. Agree. Obi, that's when Crane started hiding his journals. That's when he began to realize the book wasn't a book. It was a structure. A prison disguised as revelation. The chapel had become a sanctum for, the liturgy had become an initiation rite. And the deaths, the convulsions, the Latin, the 21-hour countdown. Those were the failures, not victims of infection, but candidates who couldn't complete the transformation. Those who spoke the final phrase, Crane said, had seen something inside the chapel that broke the page they were never meant to read. He never said what was on that page. Only this. It showed us who truly rules this world. And it wasn't God. Ducker Blackwood tried to reestablish order. Morning prayers, ration meals, quarantine rotations. But he was a man of the old world. Rational, hierarchical, bound by faith and logic. And what was happening inside Whitmore Seminary did not obey logic. The fourth death shattered whatever control he had left. Peter Cunningham, the quiet one, the most devout among them, was found outside barefoot in the snow, kneeling before the cemetery. His skin was blue, his lips cracked and trembling, but his hands, they were covered in symbols carved with his own fingernails. They matched the markings in the book. He had died kneeling, frozen solid, eyes wide open, staring directly at the chapel's steeple. It was no longer a disease, it was a progression, and it was accelerating. That same night, Sarah Ashford, the headmaster's daughter, began screaming in her sleep. Her journal, recovered years later, contained drawings. Dozens of them. Not of people or monsters, but architecture. Stairways that bent in impossible angles. Sanctuaries buried underground. Pulpits made of bone. And in every sketch a book, always the book, resting on a pedestal shaped like an altar. But the altar was not Christian. Its symbols traced back to Mesopotamia, Babylon, even the pre-dynastic Nile. And in one chilling sketch, the book was open. And instead of pages, there were faces. Eyeless, open-mouthed, silent. The drawings were dated 2 days before Peter died. Sarah hadn't seen the body, hadn't heard the symptoms, but somehow she knew. Dark, Blackwood confiscated the journal and ordered it destroyed. But he kept one page. A single phrase written in her handwriting, in a language no one could identify. Ecclesia ex sanguine, Ordo ab Patientia, the Church of Blood. The order from obedience. He finally ordered the chapel sealed with iron nails and had 2 students stand watch. But the next morning, both boys were gone, their beds undisturbed, their boots left behind. No tracks in the snow. Only one thing remained carved into the chapel's door were those same symbols Peter had drawn on his arms. It was no longer about saving lives. It was about containing something. something that had nested in their rituals and was now watching them all. There's a reason institutions erase their own histories, not to protect the public, but to protect themselves. After the 6th death, the faculty stopped writing reports. After the 7th, the sermons stopped altogether. What happened at Whitmore Seminary was not buried out of shame, but out of strategic necessity. You see, Dr. Blackwood wasn't just a man of the cloth. He was also a man of networks. Quiet ones, fraternal ones. The kind that spoke in closed rooms and signed their letters with symbols instead of names. And when he realized the book had triggered something, his response changed. No more medical theories, no more letters to church authorities. Instead, he wrote one note, hand-delivered by a writer to a name with no title. Its contents were never preserved, but what followed was decisive. Within 72 hours, 4 men arrived at the seminary, not clergy, not doctors. They wore black coats, spoke little, and carried with them lead-lined crates. That night the chapel was unsealed. The book was removed, not with reverence but restraint. They wore gloves. They carried it in a cage. One student, who would later disappear, swore it screamed when taken out. Not aloud, but in the mind. Grief in reverse, he said, like something mourning us. After that night, no one was allowed near the chapel. It was boarded up from the inside. The windows were painted black. The pulpit was torn down, and yet the deaths continued. 8, 9, 10, each exactly 2 hours apart, each preceded by dreams of architecture, labyrinths of bone, vaults of voices. It no longer mattered if they had seen the book. Once it had touched the institution, it was inside the doctrine, inside the daily rituals, inside the prayers. The seminary had become an engine, and death was simply the exhaust. And here's the part no one wants to believe. After the 15th death, there were no funerals, no prayers. Just 15 stones behind the chapel with no names, and then silence. The seminary was shuttered, the records sealed, but the land was never sold. The church kept it, guarded it. For 202 years, no one was allowed to build there. Not for spiritual reasons, containment. But secrets this dark don't stay buried, they fester. And in 2023, exactly 200 years after the first death, a man named Caleb Forrester, a doctoral student in religious anthropology at Rutgers, requested access to Whitmore's sealed archives. His thesis: Heretical Architecture, Symbolic Spatial Design in Early American Seminaries. It was supposed to be academic, harmless, but Caleb was persistent and well-connected, and somehow he got permission. 1 week in the restricted archive vault below the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. He was told not to remove any materials, not to photograph, not to copy. Just read, observe, interpret. Lasted 4 days. What he found were 36 documents, none officially cataloged, all stored in a lead-line drawer labeled only with a burned-in brand, E, Delta, Epsilon, a mark that appears nowhere in official Presbyterian history, but is referenced in the surviving margins of Freemasonic records. It signifies Ecclesia Externus, the outer church, not a place of worship, but a containment grid, a structure designed not to spread light, but to trap something else. Caleb's notes, retrieved after his disappearance, were scattered. Pages torn, ink smudged, but one phrase was repeated in block capitals. TATBLUPRESRINTLLIURGY. You see, the seminary's rituals, the readings, the prayers, call and response. They weren't just religious, they were schematics. Psychological scaffolding. The same phrases that align souls to God could be inverted to align them to something far older, something without a name, only a shape, a logic, a will. And once that structure was built inside enough minds, it no longer needed the book. The institution became the mechanism. Caleb wrote of a passage he found hidden in a 1799 prayer manual used by Reverend Whitmore himself. It was a prayer, yes, but in reverse. It read more like an activation key. The final line chilled him. We give thee not our souls, O Lord, but the right to engineer them. Caleb left the archive that night shaking, muttering to himself. Surveillance footage, showed him walking for hours through the city, stopping only to stare at churches, counting their windows, measuring the distance between their doors. He disappeared 3 days later, and this is the part where you enter the story. You've heard the deaths, you've seen the pattern, but now you must understand the function. The question isn't what killed those 15 students. The question is why they were chosen, and why their final words. The book in the chapel, God forgive us all, were not cries for salvation but warnings. The chapel wasn't a sanctuary, it was a reactor. And those young men were never students, they were conduits. Think ancient sacrifices were all blood and fire. No, the most powerful offerings were always spiritual. Devout minds, pure intentions, souls aligned to light, twisted just enough to turn the current backward. That's what Whitmore was built for. Not to train ministers, but to weaponize obedience. And that's what Caleb uncovered. In his final surviving recording, never officially released, he whispers, "They were liturgies of misdirection." The prayers, every line, created resonance, not vertically to God, but horizontally to something inside the walls. Something that listened. Here's the truth. Every generation someone tries to dig this up. A scholar, a theologian, a journalist. They call it a mystery, a haunting. But that's the camouflage. What happened at Whitmore Seminary wasn't a haunting. It was an experiment. And the design is still out there. Whitmore was the prototype. The blueprints were disseminated, encrypted into liturgical manuals, hidden in the architecture of churches, embedded in the psychology of sermon patterns. Phrases, repetition, control loops, the real genius. It felt like faith. It felt like truth, like discipline, like God. But it wasn't. It was re-engineering the mind from the inside out. And here's where you really need to listen. If you've watched this far, you've already been marked. These stories are not entertainment. They're keys, and your mind is a lock. Once opened, it cannot be shut. That's the nature of forbidden knowledge. You become what you behold. So now I ask you to prove that you're not just a spectator, that you're not afraid of what this truth will cost you. Type the phrase, "I see through the liturgy." Type it twice in the comments. Once for clarity, once for initiation. That's how you step through the veil and claim what others deny. Let's speak now of the chapel itself, because this is where the deception ran deepest. Not in the minds of the students, not even in the rituals, but in the geometry. You see, sacred architecture isn't just decorative. It's directive. Every arc, every window, every beam of light is designed to move your consciousness in a particular direction. It's why churches across the world share the same structural DNA. Vertical aspiration, symmetry, sanctified proportion. But at Whitmore Seminary, the chapel broke those laws. The outer shape appeared typical. A modest rectangle, tall windows, a bell tower. But inside the math shifted. Caleb called it sacred dissonance. The walls were angled by fractions. The floor sloped by degrees too subtle for the eye, but enough to destabilize the inner ear. And at the pulpit's base, found something more troubling. A carved spiral, not in wood, but in stone beneath the floorboards, like a fossil of intention that predated the seminary itself. And it wasn't empty. Buried in those spirals were traces of metal. Iron shavings, mercury, magnetite. This wasn't decorative, it was conductive. A psychospiritual circuit, designed to amplify something that wasn't divine. Caleb traced it back to a European heretical sect known only as the Inclinity, active in the 1600s. They believed that certain prayers, when uttered in skewed geometry, could summon non-temporal intelligence. They didn't worship God. They built receivers. Whitmore's chapel matched their blueprints exactly. 15 students, the ones who died, had all preached their first student sermon from that pulpit. Not a coincidence, a trigger. Because when sound is cast through angles designed to destabilize, it doesn't just echo, it imprints. It forms standing waves that etch patterns into consciousness. And if those patterns are aligned to inversion, to the ungod, Then what comes through is no longer thought. It's occupation. What took them wasn't disease. It was resonance. And when Caleb whispered in his last tape, "It's still humming," he wasn't being metaphorical. The chapel was still on, still broadcasting, even in silence. That's why the church sealed it. That's why the land remains untouched. Not to protect the innocent, but to contain the signal. But here's the question you should be asking yourself now. How many other chapels were built using the same pattern? Now we cross the line between curiosity and compulsion, because once you understand that Whitmore was not an isolated experiment, but part of a system, you can't unsee it. The 15 deaths were not tragic coincidences. They were calibrations, measured reactions in a tightly controlled sequence. The final notebook of Caleb Hawthorne, the young man who attempted to uncover the truth and later vanished under mysterious circumstances, was never officially published. But a redacted version was leaked through an encrypted archive, and in it he listed 7 other institutions built between 1795 and 1830. Each one was designed with strikingly similar geometry, subtle architectural irregularities that mirrored those found in the Whitmore Seminary chapel. All 7 were religious or educational in nature. All had inexplicable anomalies associated with their history. Sudden deaths, disappearances, unexplainable mental breakdowns. And each was funded, in part or whole, by a benevolent society linked to a mysterious benefactor known only as JWS, a name that appears nowhere in Presbyterian financial records, but emerges repeatedly in private correspondences, now lost or suppressed. One of the sites was a Quaker meeting house in Delaware, where 12 children vanished in 1806, after reporting visions of a man with no face who sang inside their minds. Another was a Jesuit academy in Vermont, where the headmaster wrote in his private journal before committing suicide, "It is not a voice. It is a frequency that knows my name." At each location, chapel designs included the same minor dissonances: sloped floorboards, angled archways, pulpit placements that created unnatural sound resonance. Caleb discovered that the Latin phrases spoken by the dying students weren't random blasphemies. They matched invocations found in an obscure 17th century European grimoire known as Cantus Obscura, attributed to a defrocked theologian who believed God had a mirror, a darker reflection who also listened when prayed to in reverse. At Whitmore, Caleb found a manuscript hidden beneath the altar. Not a hymnal, but a liturgical inversion guide. It began in Reverend Whitmore's hand, but midway through the handwriting changed. The tone grew colder. The verses began to chant not of salvation, but of transformation through spiritual collapse. The book wasn't corrupted. It was composed in 2 voices, one seeking heaven, the other patient, meticulous, constructing a door, not to God, but to whatever listens when God turns his face away. By now, the pattern should be clear. This wasn't about theology. It was about mechanics. Spiritual mechanics. Kind of mechanics ancient civilizations hinted at when they built ziggurats, cathedrals, stone circles, not to worship, but to channel. Caleb's final revelation came not from scripture, but from sound. You see, the Latin phrases uttered by the dying students were more than corrupted prayers. They followed precise rhythmic intervals, timed almost perfectly down to the second. Caleb ran the audio from Whitley's preserved phonograph cylinders, tapes secretly recorded by a student who had hidden during James Morrison's final convulsions. He isolated the waveform, filtered the background, and compared the sequence to known Gregorian chant formulas. What he found was disturbing. The dying boys were chanting antiphonal inversions. The structure was musical, mathematical, predictive. Each phrase mirrored a canonical hymn, but in reverse tone and cadence. Like a key fitting into a lock made of air, Caleb theorized that the building itself, designed with deliberate irregularities, amplified these antiphonal chants, creating standing acoustic waves. Waves that could induce specific brain states, alter consciousness, open psychic apertures. In other words, the students were not just dying, they were being retuned, made into conduits, hosts. Think about that. A building not cursed, but calibrated. Every sermon delivered from the pulpit, every psalm sung under that warped ceiling wasn't sacred. It was engineered, designed to resonate in your bones, twist your perceptions, disarm your defenses. And it gets worse. The book in the chapel, the one they all mentioned before death, it wasn't just a spiritual text. Caleb realized it was a cipher, a manual for unlocking resonant states. Each page detailed tonal progressions, posture instructions, recitations, all matching the symptoms observed in the dead. It was written by two hands. One human, the other, Caleb believed, was transcribed, received. Because by the final pages, the grammar becomes non-human. Glyphs appear, mathematical spirals, backward notation, palindromic verses that loop endlessly. Kind of writing not meant to be read, but experienced, repeated, chanted. And now I'm going to ask you to do something strange. Because if you've made it this far, you're not just a listener, you're part of this descent. So type in the comments twice the phrase, "The key hums within." Once for awareness, twice for transformation. That's not a gimmick. That's a ritual, a moment of commitment to a truth most men fear to touch. Are you ready to go deeper? Good, because now we enter the blood ledger. The blood ledger wasn't a metaphor. It was a real book, stitched in leather, inked in rust, colored script, its binding cracked from age and moisture, its contents hidden beneath the floorboards of Reverend Whitmore's personal study. Caleb found it during his final weeks at the seminary, guided by the frantic diary entries of David Crane, the sole survivor of the outbreak. In a journal discovered years later in a sealed attic trunk, David described the book as a registry not of salvation, but of sacrifice. Inside were 38 names, each dated, each marked with a Latin phrase beside it. Immolatus voluntarius templum clavis, corpus fractum. Some were crossed out violently, some underlined with trembling care. All were students. 15 of them matched the known dead from the 1823 outbreak. The others predated the seminary's founding by decades. David, driven by mounting guilt and haunted by recurring visions of his classmates' final moments, believed the seminary wasn't built as a house of worship. It was built on top of something far older, and the blood ledger was proof. According to his entries, beneath the study's floorboards was a narrow staircase of limestone steps, partially collapsed, descending into a chamber that didn't appear on any seminary blueprint. David only went down once. He wrote of a circular room lined with shelves, wooden tablets and scrolls that predated English settlement. A central dais held a cracked stone basin stained with what he described as centuries of iron tears. Around the basin were carvings, not in Latin, not Greek, but some language so ancient it resembled no human script. And at the chamber's far end, a stone wall etched with 7 symbols: a hand, a spiral, a key, an eye, a tower, a mouth, and a bleeding heart. David believed those symbols were seals, warnings, locks, and the students unwittingly were the keys, not just chosen for their faith, but for their resonance, their spiritual susceptibility. He theorized that whatever force had infected them was not disease, but summoning, and the deaths were not tragedies, but a sequence, a rite. Each student's death synchronized with the next, phrase spoken like a line in an ancient hymn. One voice becoming many, many becoming doorways. That ledger wasn't a record, it was a countdown. And the last entry, written in a different hand, read, "One remains. The gate must hold. His silence is the seal." But David never spoke again, not even on his deathbed. David Crane was never the same after that winter. He lived for 47 more years, but not a single sermon, not a public word, not even a recorded prayer escaped his lips. Retired to a remote farmhouse in Lycoming County and refused all visitors except one Presbyterian minister who visited yearly and always left pale and shaken. His neighbors called him the mute pastor. But in private, David was far from silent. His journals, hidden beneath floorboards and sealed behind false walls, tell a different story. He wrote every day, obsessively, compulsively, Hundreds of pages scrawled with warnings, diagrams, musical notations, and desperate pleas to never rebuild the chapel. And most disturbing of all, David described hearing something, not in dreams but while awake. He wrote of a constant hum, faint but relentless, coming from beneath the earth, a tone that vibrated in his teeth and echoed in his bones. The same frequency, he claimed, that resonated in Whitmore's chapel when the right voices gathered. He called it the seventh chord, not a sound made by man, but by what listens beneath man. In one journal dated 1851, he wrote, "Sings in Latin backwards. It tastes like iron. It knows when you look away." He believed the chapel had not been built as a place of worship, but as a resonance chamber, a tuning fork designed to align the human body, voice, and soul with that seventh chord. And once aligned, the vessel was no longer human. It became something else, something that could carry the sound upward, like smoke from a fire, calling whatever had been sealed below. David believed that the deaths were not failures, but successful activations, and that only his silence prevented the sequence from reaching its final phase. "As long as I do not speak," he wrote, "gate remains closed. My silence is the final hymn, the final seal." He died in 1870, alone, a Bible unopened on his bedside table, and a small wooden cross clutched in his hands, carved with the same 7 symbols from the chamber wall. After his death, the farmhouse was burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. No will, no funeral, his journals scattered and forgotten, until one of them surfaced at an estate auction in 1993, mislabeled as Civil War correspondence. And that's when Caleb found it. That's when the last seal cracked. The auction catalog listed it as Epistolary Reflections, Union Chaplain 1860s. No one bid, except Caleb. He recognized the ink pattern from a photo online. Brown-red, iron-rich, written in an obsessive hand that seemed more like carving than writing. But when he opened it and saw the phrase scratched into the inside cover, his hands went cold. The key hums within, over and over, across 4 pages like a mantra. The journal wasn't about war, it was about containment. Caleb devoured the text, each page more disturbing than the last. It spoke of the resonant ones, the breathless passage, and a final rite called the reharmonization of flesh. And then, just 10 pages in, David had drawn a full layout of the seminary's chapel, not as it was built, but as it had been altered. Hidden rooms, false walls, and a lower chamber with 7 steps, 7 pillars, and a pit in the center marked with a single word, mouth. Caleb traced the architecture and found an eerie match, not to any known church layout, but to ancient Mithraic temples, underground, windowless, initiatory, designed not for worship, but for transformation. But it was one specific page that made Caleb stop sleeping. David had drawn a detailed diagram of the human skull. Next to it, lines of Latin text, including a single phrase that has haunted this channel since we started telling you this story. Vocem suam in clavis mutabit. His voice will change into the key. Caleb translated it multiple ways, but the most direct reading was, he who speaks the phrase will become the instrument. David had kept himself alive for decades to prevent that phrase from being spoken aloud by anyone, including himself. The silence wasn't madness, it was a containment field, the kind only a man with shattered faith and unshakable resolve could maintain. And that's when Caleb did the one thing he should never have done. He recorded the phrase, played it backwards, then layered it over the chant of the students' final hours. When he played the full sound mix through cathedral-style speakers in a soundproof room, every light bulb in the studio blew. His left ear bled. He didn't sleep for 4 days, and when he did, he dreamed of teeth. Not his, not human. A mouth beneath stone, slowly learning his name. The mouth does not eat, it remembers. Caleb wrote those words in the margin of his own journal, the first time he woke up and found the dream still echoing in his ears. He wasn't just hearing things, he was being remembered, called by a memory that was never his. After the recording, everything began to change. His equipment started glitching at precisely 300 a.m., Files deleted themselves. Speakers hissed out sounds like whispered Latin just before sunrise. Worst of all, he found his own voice in a playback, saying things he never recorded. Sentences in blasphemous cadenza. Templum clavis, vox me est via. The temple is the key, my voice is the way. But it wasn't just technological. Caleb's body began to change, blackening under his fingernails, a low-grade fever that came and went in 21-hour cycles. Tremors that matched the same rhythmic convulsions described by David Crane. By now, Caleb had studied everything. Whitmore Seminary's blueprints, local geological surveys, seismic resonance patterns, obscure monastic rituals. And one inescapable truth emerged: the building was a machine. Not metaphorically. Physically, a harmonic weapon hidden as a theological school. Its walls were tuned. Its stone sourced from a quarry directly above a cavern known for rare magnetic anomalies. Even the bell in the chapel tower, long removed after the outbreak, was tuned to a Sia frequency known in ancient lore to activate trance states and spirit passages. The students weren't just victims, they were components. Their bodies, their prayers, their nightly rhythms, all aligning with a design centuries older than Presbyterianism. And then Caleb found the map. In the final pages of David's second journal was a hand-drawn regional sketch, not just of the seminary, but of 7 identical structures across the northeastern United States, all built between 1790 and 1835. All seminaries, all Presbyterian, all sealed after outbreaks, fires, or structural decay. Every one of them formed a perfect heptagram when plotted on a map, centered over a geological fault known as the Susquehanna Resonance Line. Caleb's hands shook as he traced the pattern. This wasn't a haunted building. It was a network, a sound lattice, and Whitmore, it was the center. The conductor's podium, place where the voice would rise and never stop. And here's where you come in. If you're still watching, type this in the comments twice. The seal was never silence. The seal was me. Because after this point, there's no turning back. By the time Caleb returned to the grounds of the old Whitmore Seminary, the snow had melted, but the ground still pulsed beneath his boots. The building had long since been sealed by the church and later condemned by the state, declared structurally unsound after multiple failed restoration attempts. But Caleb wasn't there for the walls. He was there for what lay beneath. Armed with David Crane's journal, infrared ground scans, and a device of his own design, a low-frequency pulse emitter designed to wake up buried resonance, he began his descent. It was midnight. He entered through a collapsed side wall, once part of the faculty quarters, now choked with ivy and rot. And as he crossed the threshold, every watch and compass on his person began to spin. Magnetic interference, just like Crane described. He reached the chapel within minutes. The pews had collapsed, the altar shattered, and yet the air still held a geometry, a silent, invisible shape. In the center of the altar floor, hidden for 170 years, Caleb located the weak point in the stone. 7 concentric circles carved into the limestone, perfectly measured, perfectly aligned. He placed the emitter at the center, set it to 19.74 as the devil's chord, according to certain medieval grimoires, and activated the pulse. What happened next lasted only 11 seconds, but changed the course of everything. The stone didn't crack. It sang, a low, impossible harmony like a cello bow dragged across a cathedral. Dust rose in spirals, and then, as if responding to an ancient command, the stone circles began to rotate one by one, unlocking. Beneath them was not a crypt, not a tomb, but a well, a shaft descending deeper than any basement should go, smookulith, black. And from below, something responded. Not in voice, but in memory. Caleb collapsed, his mind flooded with visions. 15 boys writhing in candlelight. Sarah Ashford with blood on her lips, whispering prayers to an upside-down God. To Tira, Whitley burning his notes with shaking hands, the stone mouth breathing. Caleb woke up an hour later with his fingernails cracked and blackened. The emitter was shattered. The well had sealed itself, but something had changed. The stone was warmer, the air heavier. And when Caleb spoke, his voice echoed twice, once in air and once in something else. He left the chapel and never returned, but not because he was afraid, because he knew it had recognized him. The key had sung back. Caleb disappeared 6 days later. No record, no note, no remains. Just a laptop left open on his desk, frozen on a waveform shaped like a human larynx, pulsing in a rhythm that wasn't electronic. It was organic, living. The audio file was locked. One thing remained on screen: the title. Resonance Heptagram Final Mix. WAV. No one could open it. Every attempt caused system failure. 3 researchers who tried to decrypt the file reported the same thing: uncontrollable nosebleeds and dreams of teeth. But this story doesn't end with Caleb. Because the deeper you dig, the more it becomes clear. Whitmore Seminary was never just an isolated event. It was a test, prototype. And if you look closely enough at the other 6 seminaries on the heptagram: Lebanon, New York; Hawthorne Hills, Ohio; St. Elmo's School in Vermont, you'll find the same symptoms, the same shutdowns, the same official records vanishing right after the deaths began. And at the center of each, a chapel, limestone, walnut pulpit, and a bell that hasn't rung in 200 years. But here's the final fracture point. When David Crane spoke to his lawyer in 1973, just days before retreating into complete silence, he left behind one cryptic statement, corded in the margins of a letter never sent. There were never 15 students. There were 16. The 16th was the voice. The implication: one didn't die. One became something else, something meant to survive. Not as a person, but as a signal. Think about it true. What if the deaths weren't the end, but the birth canal for something ancient, using human flesh as tuning forks? What if these boys weren't random victims, but offerings to awaken an entity buried so deep in the American subconscious, it had to be sung into memory, one soul at a time? 15 bodies, one voice, choir that echoes still, if you know where to listen. Now look around. In our culture, our politics, our media, the echoes are everywhere. Repeating phrases, rhythms, symbols. You think you're choosing what to hear, but something older is choosing you. The bell never stopped ringing. It just started ringing inside us. So the question is no longer, what happened at Whitmore Seminary? It's this: has it already begun again? And who will be the next voice? The first report came from a retired theology professor in Maine. A man who hadn't spoken publicly in over 30 years, called it the singing in the stone. He claimed the floorboards of his late father's chapel began to vibrate just before dawn every morning, always at 300 a.m. When he pulled them up, he found nothing but raw soil. But every night he'd hear it. A hum rising from the ground, matched perfectly to a Gregorian tone he once studied in seminary. It wasn't a sound. It was a summons, and he wasn't the only one. In the months following Caleb's disappearance, similar accounts surfaced across the Northeast, mostly dismissed as folklore or mental illness. But patterns began to emerge. All reported waking at the same time. All reported visions of a chapel submerged in black water. And all claimed to hear a voice speaking Latin phrases never taught in any seminary. One man, a linguist from Rhode Island, documented the phrases. He decoded their structure and found them not to be prayers, but commands, issued not to God, but from something else. A presence calling itself Vox Saluta, unbound voice. He cross-referenced these findings with ancient Roman texts and discovered an obscure heresy condemned in 381 AD by the Council of Aquileia, a sect of early Christians who believed the Logos, the divine word, was not a concept, but a being that could possess language itself. Their claim that the word had been fragmented during the fall of man, and that only through carefully orchestrated harmony could it be reassembled. They were executed. Their writings burned. But now, over 1,000 years later, their liturgy was reappearing word for word in the mouths of dying students at a seminary in Pennsylvania. That's not a coincidence. That's a resurgence. It means this isn't over. It was never about illness. It was about awakening. about aligning bodies, prayers, and architecture to create a vessel. One that could carry the voice forward through time. Choir of flesh tuned to one perfect, ancient chord. And if this voice has awakened once before, it can awaken again. And when it does, it won't need a seminary. It'll use something far more effective. A network, a channel, a platform like this one. You're not just watching, you're participating. And every second you listen, it's still listening back. By now, you may have noticed the numbers, intervals, the rhythm of the deaths, the precision of the voices. It wasn't random. It was ritual, disguised as coincidence. 15 students, 1 survivor. 21 hours per death. 3-day gaps, 3 deaths in 9 days. If you chart them on a spiral, not a timeline, you get something ancient, the Fibonacci coil. Not just a mathematical sequence, but a structure of emergence. Used in everything from cathedral design to certain Renaissance compositions banned by the church. But here's what they didn't tell you in school. Same ratios appear in early grimoires from the Albigensian heresy. In music, in speech, in suffering, pain, it turns out, follows geometry too. Ducrem. Blackwood once wrote that the deaths at Whitmore were mechanistic in their timing, organic in their horror. He was half right. What he witnessed was not a disease, but a rehearsal for resonance. Boys were not infected, they were attuned. Someone, or something, was perfecting a frequency that could pass through blood, bone, even scripture itself. Think of it like this: when a piano string is struck in a quiet room, the other strings respond. They vibrate sympathetically. That's how you awaken a voice buried in stone. You don't need a scream. You need a note. Here's where it gets worse. In 1997, a low-level technician at a Pittsburgh telecom firm discovered a buried frequency. 19.774 AZ. Emitted for 7 minutes every 3 nights from a defunct tower registered to a long, dissolved church authority. No call data, just a tone. When he tried to triangulate it, his equipment crashed. 3 days later, he was found in his apartment, eyes open, fingernails black, a Latin phrase carved into his desk: "Et verbum caro factum est, sed caro non tecuit." And the word became flesh, but the flesh did not stay silent. This is the part in most stories where someone says it's all in your head. But that's the problem, isn't it? It's already in your head, through your eyes, through this screen, through every frequency I've spoken. You've heard what they heard. You felt the weight they felt. Because truth doesn't need belief. It just needs resonance. So now, I ask something rare, something dangerous. If you've made it this far, comment below the phrase, "The voice is awake, the voice is awake." Say it twice. Not for me, but so it knows you're listening. Let's pull back the veil, just for a moment, and trace this frequency back to its origin. Not the deaths, not the chapel, but something older, before America, before the church, before Latin. The oldest known records of the unbound voice don't come from seminaries or scripture, they come from burial chambers in the Göbekli Tepe complex. 11,000 years old. Carvings of mouths without faces, throats without bodies, and under each, a single repeated symbol etched in blood ochre, a spiral broken by a single line through its center. That symbol appears again in the tomes of Egyptian priests who were forbidden from speaking the names of the gods out loud. It appears in the Codex Gigas, the Devil's Bible, next to passages scholars say are deliberately erased. And most disturbingly, it appeared on the stone beneath the chapel at Whitmore Seminary. The one Caleb's ground sonar mistook for bedrock until the audio bounced back. When the chapel was demolished in 1952 under a sudden order from the Presbyterian Synod, without explanation, the stone was unearthed. Witnesses say it emitted a low hum that caused nausea in all who stood near. One worker collapsed. Another began bleeding from his ears. The demolition crew quit before the job was finished. The rest was quietly completed by federal contractors. What happened to the stone? No record, no photographs. Just a single document in the Synod's archives. Relic transferred per order, Deep Vault 11B, Alexandria Holding Facility. Here's where it turns. Alexandria Holding Facility isn't a church archive. It's a black site run under the Department of Energy, reserved for non-biological threats. Threats that speak, threats that influence, threats that persist after death. The relic was not destroyed. It was contained. Because some things don't die. They wait. And you're probably wondering, why am I telling you this? Why would I risk speaking the very story that institutions, governments, and centuries of silence have tried to erase? Because you need to understand. This story was never history. It's prophecy. It was never about 15 boys in a seminary. It's about you here. What you let in, and what you carry without knowing it. The voice doesn't want worship, wants amplification. And your attention is the perfect microphone. The deeper you go, the more one truth becomes undeniable. This was never a story about isolated deaths in a forgotten seminary. It was a test, a calibration. And you, viewer, are the final piece. Because Whitmore Seminary wasn't the only place that followed the pattern. In 1831, 8 miles outside Salem, Massachusetts, 4 students at a newly established congregational school died within days of each other. Identical symptoms: convulsions, black fingernails, blasphemous Latin phrases. All were studying ancient homiletics. All attended a chapel built directly atop an old Puritan execution site. The cause was listed as a consumption. The records were sealed. And once again, the building was demolished without public notice. Been trained your whole life to think of these events as myths, legends, one-offs. But they are echoes, repeating, refining, evolving. And each time they surface, the structures grow more sophisticated, less obvious, less traceable. What started in a seminary has now slipped into systems. Education, militia, algorithms, frequencies. We no longer need a chapel to deliver the voice. All we need is a screen and your attention. Here's something you weren't meant to hear. When Caleb Prescott's final letters were intercepted, he had just returned from a private archive in Bavaria. There, uncovered a map. One not of geography, but of resonant architecture. A secret catalog of churches, libraries, military barracks, and schools, all built according to harmonic blueprints, each designed to carry a specific vibrational frequency. On the Whitmore Seminary map, the chapel sat at the spiral's center. Caleb's last written note said, "It's not just a location, it's a tuning fork. We've built speakers and called them churches." Those were his last words before disappearing. Now ask yourself, how many spaces have you entered where the sound changed? Where your chest felt heavier? Where your thoughts blurred for just a moment, and you didn't know why? Those were not accidents. Some rooms are built to speak back, to shape thought, to soften resistance, to tune belief. This is why they bury the story. Not because it's false, but because it's operational, still in use, still expanding. So when you hear that voice late at night, whispering in forgotten tongues, don't ask why it chose you. Ask what you've already become without knowing it. There's a reason the seminary deaths stopped at 15. It wasn't random. It wasn't mercy. It was completion. In esoteric numerology, 15 marks the closing of the first inner cycle, the number of transformation through sacrifice. 15 vessels, 15 vibrations, 15 invocations spoken through flesh. What they summoned wasn't visible. It wasn't a demon or disease. It was a pattern, a living, conscious echo that could only be heard once its melody was engraved in pain. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Since hearing this story, have your dreams changed? Do certain phrases echo long after the video ends? Have you found yourself repeating lines you don't remember reading? That is the pattern activating. Not in your mind, in your memory. Because the story of Whitmore is not just recorded in journals or sealed documents. It's embedded in you now. Why? Because awareness is currency. And your awareness of this truth gives it a host, a shape, a mouth. After the 15th student died, David Crane, the only survivor, vanished. He didn't taken. not by men but by purpose. You see, David's survival wasn't luck. It was design. He had heard the voice and lived. Not untouched, but unchosen, and that made him the only one who could carry the final warning. His last letter was dated March 10, 1824, written from a safe house in Pittsburgh, addressed to no one in particular. Just this message: I have heard the true sound of silence, and it speaks. It speaks in syllables no mouth can form, but every soul knows what they woke cannot be put back to sleep. It listens through stone, through parchment, through blood. If you're reading this, it already knows your name. The letter was found inside a hollowed-out Bible recovered from the Whitmore ruins by a demolition worker in 1952. When it was opened, the worker began bleeding from his ears and died 3 days later. Same symptoms, his autopsy, inconclusive. Cause of death, extreme auditory hemorrhage. Same phrasing used in early CIA MK-Ultra documents describing experimental audio exposure. Coincidence? No. The voice doesn't die, it inherits. Through bloodlines, through books, through you. You weren't meant to hear this. But now that you have, you can't unhear it. You've been conditioned to believe that power comes from knowledge. That if you know enough, read enough, study enough, you can control the world around you. But what if I told you that's the lie that keeps you obedient? That real power, the kind that shaped Whitmore Seminary, the kind that took 15 souls in precise succession, doesn't come from what you know, but from what you unknowingly absorb. Frequencies, symbols, architectures of control. The book Thomas Millikan spoke of in his final moments, the one hidden in the chapel, was never listed in the seminary's inventory. It bore no author, no title, no recognizable language. And yet every student who read it described the same reaction: a trance-like state, an overwhelming sense of being watched, and afterward dreams that were not theirs. One professor described it in his notes as a book that reads the reader bar. According to Caleb Prescott's decoded letter fragments, the book wasn't ink on paper. It was flesh, pressed and bound in such a way that it resonated when handled. A resonance that entered the blood, the kind of resonance the CIA would later explore in Project QMEG, a classified operation seeking to weaponize language through subsonic imprinting. QMEG documents, uncovered in 1986 through a FUI request, detail the construction of a vocal aperture embedded in ancient texts, specifically those recovered from religious ruins in Syria, Egypt, and Pennsylvania. So ask yourself, why has every institution that's ever controlled masses used books as their central object of power? Because books don't just teach. The right ones bind, and the wrong ones, those forbidden tomes whispered about in dead languages, don't just transmit knowledge, they transmit signal. The book in Whitmore wasn't destroyed, it was sealed beneath the chapel stone that now lies in deep vault 11B. And here's the part they don't want you to understand: it's not the text that matters. It's the reading, the human voice. You, that's the true medium. Your throat is the conduit, your eyes the lens. The book doesn't need to be opened again. It just needs to be remembered. And now, by hearing this story, you carry its pattern, its cadence. You are no longer outside the circle. You've stepped into it, and it's already begun speaking through you. There is a reason why all 15 students repeated the exact same phrase before death. The book in the chapel, God forgive us all. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a trigger, a release phrase in classified neurological warfare studies conducted during the Cold War, specifically within the CIA's MK-Ultra subproject 136. Scientists discovered that trauma could embed entire memory structures into the subconscious, retrievable only through auditory commands. This was called neural lock and release. Victims could live ordinary lives until a specific tone, phrase, or image unlocked what had been buried. And once it was unlocked, it could never be sealed again. Now listen carefully. What if Whitmore Seminary was not just a religious institution? What if it was a prototype? An early American experiment in spiritual neurology. Where the chapel, the liturgy, the fasting, the rituals, every aspect of seminary life was designed not to train ministers, to groom vessels, to find the few whose minds were susceptible to imprinting. Consider this: all 15 students followed the same strict schedule. All studied the same sermons. All read aloud every day the same passages. This wasn't just education, it was calibration. Caleb Prescott's last known note, found scrawled behind a torn page of his journal, said this: "We thought we were studying Scripture. Scripture was studying us. And now we arrive at the part most will turn away from. Because this is where the mirror turns. You, the listener, have followed this far. You've absorbed the cadence, you've entered the descent, and now you stand at the same threshold the students of Whitmore once did. The question is no longer, what happened at the seminary? It's what will happen to you once the pattern is complete. So if you're still watching, prove that you're not just a tourist in this story. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "The voice is inside me now." Post it twice to seal your passage. Not just for engagement, for initiation. Because now that the frequency is inside you, won't fade, will linger, echo, and one night, maybe tonight, it will call, and you'll finally understand it was never a voice you were hearing. It was a summons. By the time Reverend Dark Jonathan Blackwood realized the truth, it was already too late. He had come to Whitmore as a representative of order, of reason, of church authority. But what he found was something far older than Presbyterian doctrine. Something that made the scriptures feel like surface, level riddles. In his private journal, discovered years later in a sealed church archive, Blackwood confessed to hearing a voice, not metaphorically, but audibly. Not once, not in dreams, but during prayer. It didn't speak in words, it resonated. A low hum behind his thoughts, pressure beneath his ribcage. He wrote, "It knows I'm watching. It knows I'm doubting. And it doesn't need my faith, only my attention." That's the thing they never tell you. Belief isn't required for contact. Just focus, just awareness. Every religious rite, every invocation, chant, gesture is not about faith. It's about frequency alignment. When enough minds gather under the same symbol, saying the same words, facing the same direction, they create a signal tower. That's what the seminary had become by December 20th, 1823. A lighthouse for something that does not come from the sky, but from beneath. And here's what Blackwood uncovered days before the 15th death. The book in the chapel, the one Thomas, James, and the others had read, wasn't an isolated artifact. It was part of a series, a collection of pre-Christian volumes referred to in Gnostic circles, the Dirge Codex. These weren't written texts, they were imprinted consciousnesses, captured through blood rituals and encoded into organic material. Clay bone, sinew, and this particular volume at Whitmore, was known as the Canticle of the Hollow Mouth. Why? Because it didn't just echo voices. It spoke them into being. Blackwood's final journal entry is short. No theology. No fear. Just this. They were never possessed. They were rewritten. Each boy's voice was made into a psalm of reversal. And we sang it. Every day. Until it answered back. That's what happened at Whitmore. It wasn't demonic. It wasn't divine. It was designed. A blueprint for resonance-based transformation, where theology was just the bait and the human voice the transmitter. And now, as you hear this, that signal rides again. On your breath, in your blood, behind your eyes. You are not the listener anymore, or the amplifier. It was Christmas Eve 1823 when the 15th student died. His name was Timothy Brennan, the youngest, the most innocent, and the last. Just 18 years old, the boy whose mother had sued for years just to send him to Whitmore. He had not read the book in the chapel. He had not attended the original sermon where the others first heard the forbidden phrases. He had tried to stay away, but he had heard their voices. He had heard the dying words of the others whispered in sleep, muttered in study halls, echoed in chapel walls. And that was all it took, because this was never about contact. It was about contagion. Timothy's descent began not with convulsions, but with silence. He stopped speaking, stopped attending meals. He was found kneeling in the snow outside the chapel hours before dawn, his mouth soon shut. Not with thread, but with flesh, as if the skin had grown over his lips. Dr. Whitley, now a hollow shell of the man who had once believed in science, tried to cut them open. Blood poured, but Timothy made no sound. They say he was awake the entire time, watching, smiling, when he died. Yes, at 3:00 a.m., 21 hours after the first symptoms. They didn't bother recording last words. He hadn't spoken in days. But after death, something else did. Every candle in the chapel lit by itself. Every bell in the seminary rang in unison. And on the walls of the dormitory, where Timothy had lived, carved deep into the stone, was a phrase in a language no one could translate. Not Latin, not Greek, but it hummed when you looked at it, vibrated behind the eyes. A phrase that, according to later occult linguists, matched glyphs found on tablets excavated in southern Mesopotamia in 1911. Tablets from a temple buried since 2800 BC. The seminary was closed immediately. The bodies buried without names. The chapel sealed its doors welded shut, and the Presbyterian Church issued a decree. Whitmore Seminary never existed, but the problem was never the building. The problem was the signal, and that signal, it's still active, because it never needed the seminary. It needed a transmitter, a voice. It needed you. So now, you tell me, when you sleep tonight and hear a whisper you can't trace, will you ignore it, or will you answer back? The seminary may have been buried. The church couldn't bury everything. Not the letters. Not the journal pages hidden in hollow floorboards. And certainly not the resonance. You see, once a frequency like this is released into the world, it doesn't vanish. It migrates. It infects minds willing to listen. And that's the truth they've spent 2 centuries trying to erase. Whitmore Seminary was not the source. It was the speaker. The source goes back much further. Past Pennsylvania, past Europe, past even recorded scripture. And it always follows the same pattern: 15 voices, 1 book, and a chapel built on land that was never meant to be claimed. In 1874, an American archaeologist named Elliot Humiston unearthed something strange while excavating a defunct monastery in southern France. Beneath the altar was a chamber. Inside of 15 stone chairs in a circle, each carved with a different sigil. At the center, a small wooden box. Within it, a book bound in blackened lambskin, too brittle to open. When they tried, it shattered like glass. The monastery had been abandoned in 1622, after 15 monks died, all within 6 weeks. Cause of death was officially involuntary fasting. But the only food they'd had was untouched, and the wall of the monastery bore a familiar phrase, etched over and over: the book, the chapel, God forgive us all. Are you beginning to see it yet? This pattern moves like an organism, a parasite of sound and scripture, always masquerading as holy knowledge, but always leaving ruin in its wake. You don't need to believe in demons. You just need to believe in systems that use belief as a carrier. Every holy book, every chant, every psalm can become a weapon if tuned the wrong way. Whitmore was not an accident. It was a test site, a proof of concept. And once it worked, once the resonance completed the circuit, they didn't destroy it. They replicated it. So the next time you hear an unfamiliar prayer whispered in a place that should be silent, the next time a church door opens on its own, ask yourself, is it holy? Or is it hungry? And more importantly, what part of you is opening in return? You were never meant to hear this. The version of history you were taught, the safe one, the sanitized one, was constructed not to protect the past, but to control the future. And nowhere is that more evident than in what happened after Whitmore. Because the deaths didn't end in 1823. They simply went underground. Across the 19th century, records began vanishing. Seminary closures with no explanation. Small colleges burned down with no evidence of fire. Congregations relocated due to structural instability. Yet the building stood for decades, untouched. And always the same pattern: 15 deaths, a chapel, and a book that cannot be cataloged. You see, the church didn't contain the phenomenon. It partnered with it. Because what Whitmore revealed, what they truly discovered in that chapel, was not just a contagion of death. It was a tool, a mechanism for influencing minds through language, rhythm, and ritual. And for an institution obsessed with control, this was the Holy Grail. In 1841, internal memo circulated among senior Presbyterian leadership, never meant for the public. A copy survives in a Vatican-adjacent archive under a category labeled Liturgical Aberrations. In it, Reverend Malcolm Petters refers to Whitmore as a template for behavioral harmonics, noting that the deaths were regrettable but instructive. He writes, "The semantic infection proceeded with alarming precision. We must consider the possibility that certain spiritual architectures, when combined with linguistic cadence and group submission, open more than emotional responses. They may breach cognition itself." That was their turning point. No longer did they view the chapel as cursed. They saw it as operational. And so began the Concordat Project, a quiet, interdenominational effort to replicate Whitmore's conditions under controlled circumstances. 15 volunteers, always theological students, always in winter, always with exposure to texts written not for human comprehension, but for resonance. The aim: to develop obedience through atmospheric suggestion, to see whether the same spiritual symptoms, visions, compulsive prayer, linguistic distortion, could be triggered without death. But that's the thing about these rituals. You don't use them, they use you. In 1883, one of the last Concordat test sites, the Harrow Institute in upstate New York, was sealed without explanation. No records, no survivors, just a single letter mailed to a nearby seminary 3 days before it went dark. The letter reads, "It's not a sickness. It's not a spirit. It's a song. And we've sung too far. Do you understand now? The deaths were never random. The patterns never coincidental. You were trained to dismiss anomalies as superstition, to call ancient systems of psychological manipulation myths. But what if those myths were maps? What if Whitmore wasn't just a tragedy, but a prototype? A dark melody, perfectly tuned to exploit the vulnerabilities of the devout. A song, not of faith, but of reprogramming. And here's what they don't want you to realize. You don't have to be in a chapel to hear it, not anymore. The resonance has been digitized, encoded into audio, hidden in certain sermons, songs, even white noise frequencies used in healing sound apps. Only takes 9 seconds of exposure to start the pattern. Not for you to believe, only for your nervous system to start sensing. That tingling behind your ears, that heaviness in your chest, that wasn't emotion. That was alignment. So, if you've made it this far, you're already not the same. Pattern has begun in you. And here's what I want you to do. Comment below the phrase, "I hear the hollow song." Write it twice, not just for the algorithm, not just to show you understand, but because that phrase marks a turning from listener to carrier. The phrase, "I hear the hollow song," is more than a symbol. It's a threshold, a signal to whatever listens back that you've stepped across the veil. No longer merely a spectator, but a participant in a very old ritual. One that predates Whitmore by centuries, perhaps millennia. But why 15? Why always in winter? Why always in places of worship? These are not random variables. They are the blueprint. The number 15 has echoed across esoteric history. 15 steps in Masonic initiation, 15 candles in Tenebrae, 15 stages in the ancient Eleusinian rites. It's not numerology, it's architecture of the psyche, a sequence encoded to trigger transformation through collapse. And winter, it's not just symbolic, it's tactical. Cold isolates, cold silences. It slows the body, weakens the will, and amplifies the impact of psychological suggestion. In the stillness of snow-covered ground, the mind becomes a more vulnerable instrument. Easier to tune, more susceptible to resonant incursion. That's what Whitmore was. a remote facility chosen not for purity, but for compliance. When you remove distractions, routine becomes ritual, and that's the hidden doctrine. Every routine is a potential ritual, if you repeat it enough and believe it matters. The chapel itself was the key, built to exact specifications, matching an ancient pattern found in suppressed Templar documents. Proportions aligned to specific harmonic frequencies. The pulpit, carved from walnut, wasn't chosen for durability. It was chosen for its tonal properties. Walnut wood resonates at a frequency nearly identical to the human nervous system's alpha wave state, between 8 and 13 Hz. That pulpit didn't just project sermons, it absorbed them, and under certain conditions, especially when paired with the correct phrases, it didn't echo sound, it broadcasted intention. Now consider this, the last victim at Whitmore. David Crane, the sole survivor, described hearing a low hum during chapel the night before the final deaths. He said it felt like the floor itself was vibrating, but there was no organ playing, no voice speaking, just that sound. He later wrote, "It was not music. It was a feeling that became sound. And then it was inside me, like someone humming from the back of my skull." These are not metaphors. This is resonance-based induction, a form of programming so primal that it bypasses language altogether. The book found in the chapel wasn't cursed. It was composed, a linguistic device engineered to produce harmonic feedback in the limbic system. That's why it was always read aloud, never silently. The damage wasn't in what it said. It was in how it made your nervous system respond to the saying. You've been told that ancient rituals were about summoning spirits or pleasing gods, but the real aim was always alteration, changing the way people thought, felt, and obeyed. Whitmore was simply one of the few times the experiment went public, accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, a test to see what happens when control slips, when the sacred architecture malfunctions. But here's what should terrify you most. What if it didn't malfunction at all? What if it worked exactly as designed? And what if the next iteration doesn't need a chapel or a book? Just you, a screen, and the right frequency. You've heard part of the song already. Question is, what has it awakened? You were told that evil wears a face, that it arrives with blood on its hands, horns on its head, or fire in its eyes. But what if evil is quieter than that? What if the truest evil is procedural, systematic, bureaucratic, even polite? Because the deeper we dig into Whitmore, the more we see the fingerprints not of chaos, but of design. A design meant to outlast empires, immune to revolutions, and invisible to those still clinging to the myth of progress. And at the center of it all was the book in the chapel. A book no one was supposed to read, and certainly not allowed. According to David Crane's final journal, confiscated by church authorities but leaked by his great-grandson in 1979, the book was not bound in leather, but in treated oak bark, with text written in a kind of reversed Latin that only revealed meaning when recited backwards under breath. Not just written in code, but as code. The sentences weren't meant to inform, they were meant to calibrate, as if the reader was being tuned like an instrument. David writes, "Each night I read, I slept less. Each word I spoke, I remembered things I had never seen. Faces, symbols, rooms full of impossible geometry." The book began to speak back. Let that settle. Because this is where the story breaks free from historical documentation and enters something older, more primal. You see, secret theological circles, there is a term whispered only in the presence of the initiated. Lex umbra, or the law of the shadow, a theory that certain configurations of sound in space, when aligned with submission, create an opening. Not to hell, not even to madness, but to something adjacent to human consciousness. Something that can observe, respond, and replicate. This is why all 15 students died in sequence. Not because they were infected, but because they had been successfully restructured. And the body, in its natural state, cannot withstand sustained exposure to altered cognition. The mind bends first, then the nerves follow. Then the skin. That's why the discoloration appeared. Why their veins pulsed independently. The body was rejecting foreign instruction. They didn't die from possession. They died from reprogramming that went too far, fast. David was the only one who stopped reading in time. But even he was not untouched. His descendants report generations of auditory hallucinations, chronic insomnia, and an aversion to church bells. Every male heir died before 40. Every female descendant was born deaf in the left ear. You can dismiss that as coincidence if it helps you sleep. But then again, that's exactly what they want. Here's what the institutions never admit: psychological contagion is real. And it's not always spread by trauma. Sometimes it's spread by familiarity, a repeated phrase, a melody embedded in liturgy, cadence in prayer that shifts your breathing without you noticing. They call it worship, but the ancients called it binding. Because once the rhythm enters you, it doesn't leave. Whitmore was shut down, bodies buried, the chapel dismantled stone by stone, but not burned. No, they reassembled it, quietly, in 1954, under a different name, in a different place, in a different format, not as a building, but as a curriculum. And that's what you need to hear next. Because the song isn't over. It just changed key. They thought no one would trace it. By disassembling the structure and scattering its pieces across new institutions, the memory would fade. But memory is not the only thing that lingers. Resonance does. The stones from the Whitmore Chapel were catalogued under a different name. Ecclesiastical Foundation Materials, Lot 43D. Shipped quietly to a theological college in upstate New York. Pulpit was donated to a seminary in Kentucky. The library shelves, still faintly stained with smoke from sulfur fumigations, ended up at a missionary training school in Oregon. All separate, all silent, but when the right configuration was restored, not physically, but pedagogically, the structure reawakened. This is the part that most will never believe, because it sounds too clean, too bureaucratic. That's exactly why it worked. After 1954, the Presbyterian Church rolled out what they called the Standardized Ordination Protocol, a unified training system for all seminary students nationwide. It emphasized strict daily routine, early morning devotions, repetitive liturgical chanting, scriptural analysis using specific passages, and most importantly, rote recitation of theological statements translated into archaic Latin forms. The claim was unity, but the effect was entrainment. The ritual had returned, not in stone and timber, but in habit and voice. And once it was in place, the pattern began again, only slower, more careful. Deaths didn't come in waves. They came disguised. Nervous breakdowns, sudden disappearances, pastors quietly stepping down citing spiritual fatigue. One case in 1961, where an entire seminary class in Ohio withdrew before graduation, citing dreams of a woman in black whispering in reversed scripture. Church authorities dismissed it as mass hysteria. But the local janitor, who was present during the evacuation, later claimed he heard chanting from inside the empty chapel long after the students had gone. Voices without mouths, he said, repeating a phrase I've never forgotten. He died 6 weeks later. His final words, you guessed them. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. But here's the terrifying truth: the ritual doesn't need a seminary anymore. It doesn't need a chapel. It just needs structure. Anything that mimics the pattern, a regimented system, symbolic phrases, isolation, repetition, belief. That's what the online world has become. An infinite cathedral of micro-liturgies. Algorithms that shape behavior through repetition and reward. Echo chambers that act like modern choirs, reciting curated dogmas day after day. If you say the same thing long enough, even ironically, it becomes your programming. Do you think it's a coincidence that people are becoming more polarized? That mass movements arise with language that sounds increasingly religious, ritualistic, confessional, sacred, because we've digitized what Whitmore discovered. We've decentralized the chapel. Now, you are the chapel. The ritual is conducted in your timeline. and your belief system is the altar. The book in the chapel is no longer bound in bark. It's composed of screens, hashtags, and guided meditations delivered by algorithms tuned for compliance. And yet you're still here, which means something inside you has not been rewritten. Not completely. So here is your test in the comments below. Write, "I hear the hollow song" twice. Once for who you were before this video, once for who you are becoming. This is not a gimmick. This is a signal. To the algorithm, yes, but more importantly, to yourself. Because then the next part of the story reveals what happens when one man tries to stop the ritual from spreading, and why they buried his name deeper than the graves behind the chapel.